Giuseppe Garibaldi, the hero of two worlds, the silent shore. The wind carried salt and secrets across the Mediterranean that summer evening in 1833. A young merchant captain stood on the deck of his ship, the Clorinda, moored in the Russian port of Taganrog on the Sea of Azov. The vessel creaked gently against its moorings, timber settling after the long voyage. Giuseppe Garibaldi had sailed thousands of miles, carried oranges across distant waters, traded in ports from Constantinople to Marseille. He lived the life his father and grandfather had lived, the life of the sea, governed by tides and wind and the weight of cargo in holds. But something within him remained unsettled, like a compass needle trembling before finding true north. 26 years old, Giuseppe possessed the weathered confidence of a man who'd commanded vessels through storms and negotiated with merchants in foreign tongues. His hands bore the calluses of rope and rigging, permanent markers of his trade. His eyes had learned to read storms gathering on distant horizons and navigate by stars when clouds obscured the moon. The sea had taught him patience, resilience, and the knowledge that survival often depended on decisions made in moments of crisis. Yet, for all his maritime expertise, none of his voyages had prepared him for what waited in a simple inn that night. The port city buzzed with the multilingual chatter of traders, the clang of cargo being loaded and unloaded, the smell of tar and fish and distant cooking fires. 10 days in port. Time to offload the oranges, negotiate new cargo, repair what needed fixing on the Clorinda. Routine business for a merchant captain. But routine was about to shatter. Born on July 4, 1807 in Nice, then briefly under French control before passing to the Kingdom of Sardinia in 1814, Giuseppe belonged to a family of fishermen and coastal traders. The Garibaldis were Nizzardo Italians, part of a vibrant community that identified culturally with Italy, despite Nice's changing political masters. Their livelihood was carved from the moods of the sea, from knowledge passed down through generations about winds, currents, and the temperament of Mediterranean waters. His father, Domenico, captained coastal trading vessels, while his mother, Rosa Raimondi, managed the household with quiet strength. Rosa had different dreams for her second son. She'd hoped he might enter the priesthood, become a man of books and benedictions, secure and respectable. A priest in the family meant status, education, a refuge from the uncertainties of maritime trade. But Giuseppe had felt the pull of the ocean from his earliest memories. The harbor was his playground. The smell of salt and tar and fresh-caught fish was the air he breathed. By age 8, he could identify vessels by their rigging. By 10, he could read weather patterns in cloud formations. The sea spoke to him in a language more compelling than any liturgy. At 15, over his mother's protests, he signed aboard a merchant vessel. It was 1822, and the Mediterranean was recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, slowly rebuilding the trade networks that had sustained it for millennia. Giuseppe learned seamanship the hard way, through mistakes that could mean death, through storms that tested every sailor's courage, through the grinding routine of life at sea where weakness found no mercy. His early adventures already hinted at the audacity that would define him. At 14, some sources claim, he and friends attempted to run away from school in a stolen sailboat, heading for Constantinople. Whether the story is completely true or embellished doesn't matter. It captured something essential about Giuseppe's spirit. He was always moving towards something larger, some destiny he couldn't yet name. By his mid-20s, he'd earned his master's certificate as a merchant captain, a significant achievement for someone of his background. He commanded vessels through waters both calm and treacherous, learned to negotiate with merchants in multiple languages, developed the physical toughness and mental discipline that would serve him in battles yet to come. But navigation teaches only how to reach destinations. It doesn't reveal why destinations matter. In that inn at Taganrog, Giuseppe met Giovanni Battista Cuneo, a political exile from Italy, a man whose very presence in Russia testified to the dangers of revolutionary thinking. Cuneo spoke of things that made the air between them electric with possibility. He spoke of La Giovine Italia, young Italy, a secret movement led by Giuseppe Mazzini. He spoke of Italian identity, of shared language and culture that transcended the arbitrary borders drawn by foreign powers and ancient aristocracies. He spoke of a dream so audacious it seemed mad, that the fractured, foreign-ruled territories of the Italian peninsula might one day become one nation, free and unified. For over 1,000 years, Italy had been what Austrian Chancellor Metternich dismissively called a geographical expression, not a country. Since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the peninsula had been conquered, divided, and fought over by virtually every European power. Austrian boots trampled Lombardy and Venetia in the north. Spanish Bourbons ruled the kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south. The Papal States sprawled across central Italy, governed by the Pope as both spiritual leader and temporal monarch. Everywhere, foreign powers and petty tyrants divided what had once been the heart of the Roman Empire. The common people suffered most. Peasants lived in medieval poverty, taxed heavily to support foreign armies and corrupt local officials. Intellectuals faced censorship and surveillance. Anyone who spoke of unity or constitutional rights risked imprisonment or execution. The Italy Cuneo described existed only as a memory of glory days long past, and a hope for a future that seemed impossible. Yet Giuseppe listened, and something fundamental shifted inside him. It wasn't a sudden conversion. It was recognition. All those years at sea, moving between ports, hearing different dialects but understanding them all as Italian, they had prepared him without his knowing. He'd seen Nice passed from French to Sardinian control, as though cities and their people were mere possessions to be traded. He'd witnessed poverty and oppression from Marseille to Constantinople, but he'd never had the framework to understand why it had to be that way. Cuneo gave him that framework, and with it, purpose. 3 months later, in November 1833, Giuseppe traveled to Geneva specifically to meet Giuseppe Mazzini himself. The prophet of Italian nationalism was 38 years old, a man of burning intensity who spoke of liberty and destiny with a fervor that bordered on religious ecstasy. Thin, pale, dressed always in black to mourn Italy's subjugation, Mazzini was either a visionary or a madman, depending on who you asked. He envisioned a united, republican Italy built on the will of the people, not imposed by kings or conquerors. He preached revolution as a sacred duty, moral obligation as powerful as any religious commandment. Italy must be one. Italy must be free, and Italians themselves must be the authors of their own liberation. Mazzini had founded Young Italy in 1831 with these principles. Italy should be a democratic republic. National unity should be achieved through popular insurrection. Patriots should be willing to sacrifice everything for the cause. It was romantic, idealistic, and, to established powers, profoundly dangerous. Giuseppe, the sailor who'd never thought much about politics or philosophy, found himself utterly captivated. Here was someone who could articulate what he'd felt but never expressed, that his homeland deserved better, that foreign domination wasn't natural or inevitable, that ordinary people possessed the power to change history. He joined the Carbonari Revolutionary Association, a secret society that had been working toward Italian unification for years. He took an oath, a vow to dedicate his life to the liberation of his homeland from Austrian dominance and internal tyranny. The oath demanded absolute commitment. Members who betrayed the cause faced death, but Giuseppe didn't hesitate. The vow would cost him nearly everything he had, and make him into something he never imagined he could be. In February 1834, the first test came. Mazzini organized an ambitious plot to spark a republican revolution in Piedmont. The plan involved multiple coordinated actions. Garibaldi would help seize the frigate Eurydice in the port of Genoa. Other conspirators would capture the arsenal and distribute weapons to the population. And simultaneous uprisings in other cities would create an unstoppable wave of revolution. It was bold, It was ambitious. It required perfect timing and absolute secrecy, and it failed spectacularly before it even began. Piedmontese authorities, aided by informers and competent intelligence work, uncovered the conspiracy. The arrest warrants went out before Giuseppe could even approach the Eurydice. He learned of the failure through hushed warnings from sympathizers who risked their own safety to alert him. The conspiracy had been crushed. Those caught faced immediate execution. Giuseppe fled. There was no time for farewells, no time to gather possessions. He moved through the night like a man pursued by wolves. Because he was. Across the border into France, traveling on foot and by whatever transport he could find, sleeping in fields when he had to, he made his way to Marseille. There, in a café, he picked up an Italian newspaper and read his fate. A Genoese court had condemned Giuseppe Garibaldi to death in absentia for treason against the state. He was 27 years old. His life as he'd known it was over. The sentence meant he could never return to Nice or any Piedmontese territory. If caught, he would be hanged or shot. His family would suffer the shame of having a son declared a traitor. His mother's dreams of him becoming a respectable priest seemed like memories from another person's life. So Giuseppe did what men without countries do. He booked passage on a ship bound for South America. If he couldn't fight for Italy yet, he would learn how to fight. If he couldn't liberate his homeland, he would liberate someone else's and gain the skills he'd need when his moment came. The Atlantic stretched before him like eternity. Behind lay everything familiar. Ahead lay exile, war, and a love that would define him forever. Exile and fire. The Atlantic stretched before him like eternity when Giuseppe departed Marseille in 1836. He was sailing not towards something, but away from everything. Away from death sentences and failed revolutions. Away from a homeland that wanted him dead. Away from the life he'd expected to live. The voyage took weeks, the ship rising and falling on endless swells, the horizon a circle that never changed. He arrived in Rio de Janeiro, stepping off the ship into the thick, humid air of tropical Brazil, into a world completely unlike the Mediterranean he'd always known. Brazil had won independence from Portugal in 1822, but independence had brought civil war rather than peace. Regional factions fought for power. Provinces rebelled against the central government. It was chaos, and for Giuseppe, opportunity. In the far south, the province of Rio Grande do Sul was attempting to break away from the Brazilian Empire. The rebels, called farrapos, meaning tatters or ragamuffins, a name they wore with pride, had declared the Rio Grandense Republic in 1836. They fought a guerrilla war against the much larger, better-equipped imperial Brazilian forces. The conflict would become known as the Ragamuffin War, lasting from 1835 to 1845. Giuseppe heard about the struggle from other Italian expatriates in Rio de Janeiro. He talked to captured Republican prisoners being held in the city. What he learned spoke to something deep in his revolutionary soul. These farrapos weren't fighting for personal gain or dynastic ambition. They were fighting for self-governance, for freedom from what they saw as oppressive rule by a distant emperor. It was the same fight Mazzini preached in Italy, just transplanted to South American soil. Giuseppe Garibaldi needed a cause. The farrapos needed experienced naval commanders. He volunteered as a naval captain for the Rio Grandense Republic. What followed were years that would forge him like iron in a blacksmith's fire. Heated, hammered, shaped through repeated blows into something stronger than raw material could ever be. Giuseppe learned to command under impossible circumstances. The Republic's navy consisted of small ships, often captured vessels refitted for war, manned by crews with more courage than training. He led naval raids against Brazilian merchant shipping, operating essentially as a privateer, or as the Brazilians called him, a pirate. The distinction depended entirely on which side you supported. The Brazilian Empire had professional military forces, established supply lines, and the resources of a large nation. The Rio Grandense Republic had determination, knowledge of local terrain, and not much else. Giuseppe learned to compensate for inferior resources through superior tactics. Hit fast, strike where unexpected, vanish before overwhelming force could respond. These weren't the tactics of conventional warfare taught at military academies. They were the tactics of desperation, of making necessity into virtue. He fought battles on land and sea, often outnumbered, always outgunned. Victory came rarely and tasted more like survival than triumph. Men under his command died. Ships were lost. Entire campaigns ended in defeat. But Giuseppe endured, learned, adapted. Each failure taught lessons that conventional military success never could. The campaigns took him along the coast and into the interior of southern Brazil. He saw landscapes of stunning beauty, mountains rising from coastal plains, rivers cutting through dense forests, endless grasslands where gauchos herded cattle. He also saw the brutal reality of war. Burned villages, starving refugees, bodies left unburied. The way conflict ground ordinary people into dust, regardless of which side claimed righteousness. It was harrowing. It was transformative. Every day tested whether his revolutionary ideals could survive contact with revolutionary reality. And then, in October 1839, everything changed. He first saw her in Laguna, a town on the Brazilian coast where Republican forces had briefly established control. Ana Maria de Jesus Ribeiro, known as Anita, was sitting near a window when Giuseppe passed. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances of their meeting, as legends tend to grow around moments that change lives. But what's certain is that Giuseppe was instantly, completely struck. She was 28 years old, from a poor family of Azorean Portuguese descent, herdsmen and fishermen who'd scratched out life in Santa Catarina province. Married unhappily at age 14 to Manuel Duarte Aguiar, a man who'd abandoned her to join the imperial army, she had little reason to love the established order. She had piercing black eyes, an olive complexion, and a bearing that suggested she'd never accepted anyone telling her what she couldn't do. According to legend, Garibaldi looked at her through that window and whispered, "Tugu moi," a phrase he'd picked up from locals, essentially meaning, "You must be mine." And somehow, impossibly, she agreed. Not immediately, but something passed between them in that moment, recognition perhaps of kindred spirits. Within days, Anita had left her absent husband and joined Giuseppe aboard his ship, the Rio Pardo. This wasn't some romantic flight from danger into safety. This was a woman stepping directly into war. Within a month of joining Giuseppe, Anita was fighting alongside him. This wasn't metaphor or romantic exaggeration embellished by later biographers. Anita truly, actually fought. She learned to load and fire weapons. She manned positions during naval engagements. She rode with cavalry units when campaigns moved inland. One of Garibaldi's comrades would later describe her as an amalgam of two elemental forces, the strength and courage of a man and the charm and tenderness of a woman, manifested by the daring and vigor with which she had brandished her sword and the beautiful oval of her face that trimmed the softness of her extraordinary eyes. The stories of her courage became legendary even during their lifetime. At the Battle of Curitibanos, Imperial Brazilian forces overran the Republican position, and Giuseppe became separated from his unit. Anita was captured. The Brazilian guards, perhaps trying to break her spirit, told her Giuseppe had been killed in the fighting. Devastated, she asked permission to search among the dead to find his body and give him proper burial. When she searched the battlefield and didn't find him among the corpses, hope flickered. If he wasn't dead, he might be alive. That night, Anita crept up on a camp horse, mounted it despite guards nearby, and escaped at full gallop into the darkness. She reunited with Giuseppe days later, after surviving alone in hostile territory. On another occasion, Republican forces needed to cross the Canoas River to escape pursuing Imperial troops. The river was flooded from mountain runoff, 500 yards of churning water, more cataract than river. Other soldiers hesitated at the bank, knowing that attempting to cross meant likely drowning. Anita didn't hesitate. She plunged her horse into the torrent. Clinging to its mane, bullets from Brazilian soldiers on the far bank peppering the water around her, She fought the current for what must have felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Somehow, against probability, she reached the opposite shore. "My wife is valiant," Giuseppe would say simply when recounting these stories, as though extraordinary bravery were the most ordinary thing in the world. Perhaps, for Anita, it was. They married according to local custom on the ship, a maritime ceremony that might not have been legally binding, but bound them in ways that mattered more than law. Their first child, Menotti, named after an Italian revolutionary, was born in September 1840 while they were still fighting. Anita gave birth during one of the most desperate periods of the war, when Republican forces were suffering brutal defeats and being driven into retreat. The Rio Grandense forces, hammered by effective Brazilian campaigns, fell back into the western highlands of Rio Grande do Sul. It was winter, which in southern Brazil means temperatures dropping below freezing at night in the mountains. Rain turned paths into quagmires of mud. Streams, swollen with runoff, became impassable barriers. Food ran out almost completely. The retreating army survived on small forest animals, wild berries, whatever they could forage or hunt. Disease swept through the ranks. Anita had just given birth. She carried infant Menotti in a large handkerchief tied around her neck, using her body heat and breath to keep him warm against the mountain cold. Sometimes Giuseppe carried him the same way when Anita's strength failed. They took turns, sharing the burden, never complaining because complaining changed nothing. People died in that retreat. Many people. Bodies were left behind because there was no time or strength to bury them properly. The survivors emerged more like ghosts than an army, gaunt, exhausted, traumatized by what they'd endured. But Anita, Giuseppe, and their infant son endured. The retreat covered 400 miles, from the coast to San Gabriel in the interior. It took weeks of constant movement, constant fear, constant physical suffering. When they finally reached relative safety, Anita's primary concern wasn't her own condition. It was whether Menotti had survived. He had, against all reasonable odds. By 1841, the Rio Grandense cause was clearly failing. The Brazilian Empire, despite occasional defeats, had resources the Republic couldn't match. The war had become an exhausting stalemate that would eventually end in Republican defeat. Giuseppe took leave from the fighting. He and Anita, along with baby Menotti, traveled overland to Montevideo, Uruguay. Another 400-mile journey, this time driving a herd of cattle they'd acquired, trying to build something resembling normal life. In Montevideo, Uruguay's capital, Giuseppe attempted to settle into civilian existence. He worked as a trader, buying and selling goods. He taught mathematics and other subjects in a school. Anita ran their household, cared for Menotti. For about a year they tried to be ordinary people living ordinary lives. It lasted approximately 12 months before Giuseppe couldn't stand it anymore. He wasn't made for merchant life. Teaching restless children arithmetic felt like wearing someone else's clothes. The sea called. More importantly, Uruguay was embroiled in its own civil war, and Giuseppe couldn't remain uninvolved when fighting was happening. In 1842, Garibaldi took command of the Uruguayan Navy. Uruguay was locked in what would be called the Guerra Grande, the Great War, a complex civil war entangled with regional power struggles. President Fructuoso Rivera and his Colorado Party, liberals representing Montevideo and coastal interests, fought against Manuel Uribe and his Blanco Party, conservatives representing rural interior. But it wasn't just an internal conflict. Argentine dictator Juan Manuel de Rosas backed Uribe, seeing control of Uruguay as essential to Argentine dominance. Helping Rivera meant opposing Rosas and his vision of regional hegemony. Giuseppe accepted command of Uruguay's small naval forces. It wasn't much of a navy, a handful of vessels, crews of varying quality, resources stretched impossibly thin. But he'd worked with less. He understood how to make limited resources count. More significantly, in 1843, he formed the Italian Legion from Montevideo's expatriate community. The city had a substantial Italian population, over 4,000 out of 30,000 total residents, according to an 1843 census. These were exiles, economic migrants, political refugees, people who'd left Italy for various reasons but maintained fierce loyalty to their homeland's cause. Giuseppe called on them to fight for Uruguay as preparation for eventually fighting for Italy. The connection wasn't obvious at first. Why should Italians die for Montevideo? But Giuseppe understood something profound. Learning to fight together, developing trust and tactical skill, creating a culture of discipline and sacrifice. These things didn't depend on fighting on Italian soil. They could fight for Uruguay's freedom now and carry those lessons home later. The Italian Legion wore red shirts. The origin of this iconic uniform had nothing to do with symbolism or careful planning. Giuseppe found them at a good price from a Montevideo factory that had manufactured them for export to Argentine slaughterhouses, where workers needed protective clothing that hid bloodstains. When those orders were cancelled, Giuseppe purchased the surplus. Practicality created an icon. The red became their trademark, their badge, the visual representation of their cause. When people saw the red shirts, they saw Giuseppe Garibaldi's fighters. They saw men who chose principle over safety, who fought against tyranny wherever they found it. Between 1842 and 1848, the Italian Legion and Uruguayan forces defended Montevideo against forces led by Manuel Uribe and backed by massive Argentine military support. It was siege warfare, urban combat, the grinding attrition of a city under constant pressure. Supplies ran short. Disease spread through crowded quarters. Artillery bombardments became routine. But Montevideo held. Giuseppe led numerous sorties and battles during these years. At Cerro in 1843, his forces achieved a small but significant victory. At Sant'Antonio in February 1846, the Italian Legion won what would become their most famous engagement. The battle wasn't large by European standards, a few hundred fighters on each side, but it was heroic in execution. The Legion, outnumbered and fighting in difficult terrain, broke through Uribe's forces and won decisively. News of Sant'Antonio spread to Europe and particularly to Italy. Here was an Italian fighting force, organized and effective, winning battles thousands of miles from home. Italian patriots, unable to fight Austrian occupation directly, raised money to present Giuseppe with a sword of honor. The weapon itself mattered less than what it represented. Giuseppe Garibaldi was becoming famous for fighting other people's wars with such distinction that his homeland noticed. During these years, Anita bore 3 more children. Rosita arrived in 1843, but died 2 years later, one of the countless children who didn't survive to adulthood in that era. Teresita, was born in 1845, and Ricciotti arrived in 1847. Giuseppe officially married Anita in the Church of St. Francis of Assisi in Montevideo on March 26, 1842, giving their union religious and legal sanction. Anita participated in the defense of Montevideo in 1847, though by then her role had shifted somewhat. With multiple children to care for and approaching her mid-30s after years of warfare, she couldn't engage in frontline combat as she once had. But she remained Giuseppe's counselor, his most trusted advisor, the person who understood him completely. A skilled horsewoman from her Brazilian upbringing, she taught Giuseppe about gaucho culture, the ways of the South American plains, the clothing, the customs, the style of warfare practiced by mounted fighters on the pampas. Giuseppe adopted the gaucho style of dress, the red shirt, the poncho draped over shoulders, the wide-brimmed hat. It became his personal trademark, a reminder of where he'd learned his craft. The French writer Alexandre Dumas père visited Montevideo in 1847 and met Giuseppe. Dumas, already famous for works like The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo, recognized material for an epic tale. His later biographical work on Garibaldi added adventures to an already adventuresome life, sometimes embellishing details, but capturing the essential truth. Here was a man living like a character from romantic fiction. South America had given Giuseppe something more valuable than fame or skill, though it had given him both. It had given him Anita, a partner who understood that revolutionary ideals and love weren't contradictory, but complementary. It had taught him guerrilla warfare, how to move fast, hit hard, and melt away before superior forces could crush him. It had shown him that ordinary people, inspired by just causes and led effectively, could stand against empires and professional armies. It had proven that believing in impossible dreams doesn't make them real, but refusing to abandon them sometimes does. And in early 1848, news arrived that made exile unbearable. Revolution had erupted across Europe. Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Milan. The old order was crumbling. In Italy, the Austrian Empire that had occupied Lombardy and Venetia for decades was being challenged. In Rome, liberal forces threatened the power of the Pope. Pius IX, the newly elected pontiff, had begun his papacy with surprising reforms, leading some to believe he might support Italian unification. King Charles Albert of Piedmont-Sardinia had taken up arms against Austria. The moment Giuseppe had dreamed of for 14 years had arrived. The cause that had led him to risk death in 1834, that had sent him into exile, that had driven him through years of warfare in lands not his own. That cause was finally active in Italy itself. He gathered 60 members of his Italian legion and prepared to sail home. Anita came with him. Of course she did. They were bound together by more than love now. They were bound by shared battle, by shared grief for children lost and comrades who died, by shared purpose that transcended personal happiness. In April 1848, Giuseppe, Anita, and the Red Shirts departed South America. Behind them lay 12 years of exile, of war, of becoming who they needed to be. Ahead lay a motherland most of the Legion had never seen, a dream of unity that seemed barely possible, and a destiny waiting to be claimed or lost forever. Giuseppe Garibaldi was 40 years old. He'd been sentenced to death in Italy for revolutionary activity and hadn't set foot there in 14 years. Returning meant risking that sentence being carried out. But he'd long since stopped caring about personal safety. Fear had been burned out of him in Brazilian rivers and Uruguayan sieges. All that mattered now was Italy, the homeland that existed more in hearts than on maps. The nation that wasn't yet a nation, but might become one if enough people believed and enough people fought. The Atlantic crossing felt different this time. In 1836, he'd sailed away from Italy in disgrace. In 1848, he was sailing toward it as a warrior tested in 100 battles, leading trained soldiers, carrying the hopes of everyone who believed Italy could be free. Return to the motherland. When Garibaldi landed in Nice in June 1848, Europe was ablaze with revolution. The old empires trembled. Monarchy and despotism faced challenges everywhere. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the age of kings might be ending, replaced by republics built on the will of the people. Italy, however, remained a patchwork. The kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia in the northwest, Austrian-controlled territories in the north and east, the Papal States across the center, the kingdom of the Two Sicilies dominating the south and Sicily, each a separate entity, often hostile to the others. Mazzini's dream of a united, republican Italy seemed as distant as ever. But hope surged through Italian patriots. Pope Pius IX had begun his papacy with surprising liberal reforms, leading some to believe he might support unification. King Charles Albert of Piedmont-Sardinia had taken up arms against Austria, beginning what would be called the First Italian War of Independence. Garibaldi offered his services first to the Pope. Pius IX refused. Giuseppe then offered himself to King Charles Albert. The king also refused, viewing Garibaldi as a dangerous radical whose death sentence for the 1834 conspiracy still stood. The regular Piedmontese army despised this self-taught guerrilla leader who'd spent years fighting for rebels in South America. Rejected by both religious and royal authority, Garibaldi went where he was wanted: Milan. The Lombard city had risen against Austrian occupation, declaring itself free. Mazzini had already arrived, bringing his republican fervor. When Garibaldi and his red shirts entered Milan, they were welcomed as heroes. Giuseppe didn't care about official approval anymore. He would fight Austria with or without royal blessing. He led his volunteers in engagements at Luino and Morazzone against Austrian forces. The battles were small but fierce. Garibaldi emerged with his reputation intact and growing. He fought like no regular army officer, moving quickly, striking unexpectedly, using terrain to compensate for inferior numbers and equipment. But King Charles Albert, after defeat at the Battle of Custoza, agreed to an armistice with Austria. The war ended in failure. The dream of expelling Austria from northern Italy collapsed. Many revolutionaries despaired. Not Garibaldi. For him, the fight had only begun. As 1848 turned to 1849, a new front opened. Rome, the eternal city, the seat of papal power for over a millennium, declared itself a republic. Pope Pius IX, threatened by liberal forces demanding democratic reforms, fled the city in disguise. The Roman Republic was proclaimed on February 9, 1849, with government led by a triumvirate that included Mazzini. Garibaldi, despite his clashes with Mazzini over tactics and temperament, answered the call to defend Rome. He couldn't resist. This was the heart of Italy. If they could hold Rome, they could prove that a new kind of Italy was possible. The Roman Republic. Rome in the spring of 1849 crackled with revolutionary energy and looming dread. The Republic represented everything Mazzini had preached for decades: government by the people, freedoms of speech and assembly, radical reforms including education for all and abolition of the death penalty. The Roman Assembly had declared the temporal power of the Pope ended. Rome would be governed by elected representatives, not divine mandate. It was an audacious experiment in the very shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, conducted in a city that for over a millennium had been synonymous with papal authority. The reforms came rapidly. Church property was being redistributed, prisons were opened, political prisoners freed, the death penalty was abolished. A revolutionary concept in an age when execution was routine punishment for numerous offenses. Education was declared a right, not a privilege of the wealthy. These weren't mere pronouncements. Actual implementation was beginning. But powerful enemies were gathering like storm clouds on every horizon. Austria wanted to crush Republican movements everywhere, viewing them as existential threats to the Habsburg Empire's multinational structure. The Kingdom of Naples, under Bourbon rule firmly allied with reactionary forces, saw the Roman Republic as a direct threat that could inspire their own subjects to rebellion. Spain, still clinging to its Catholic monarchist traditions and its self-image as defender of the faith, opposed any challenge to papal authority. And France, now led by Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte and future Napoleon III, had complex motivations: maintaining French influence in Italy, appeasing conservative Catholic voters at home, and demonstrating French power in European affairs. Louis Napoleon sent an expeditionary force under General Nicolas Oudinot to restore Pope Pius IX by force. French soldiers, troops of the Republic that had sparked 1848's revolutionary wave, would destroy the Roman Republic to reinstall absolute papal monarchy. The irony was bitter. The odds were overwhelming. The Republic's defenders numbered perhaps 15,000 men, mostly volunteers with minimal training. They faced professional armies totaling perhaps 60,000 troops with artillery, cavalry, organized supply lines, and battle-hardened commanders. Giuseppe Garibaldi took command of Rome's defenses, understanding they would almost certainly lose. The question was how they would lose: quickly and shamefully, or in a way that would inspire future generations. He chose the latter. Anita stood at his side. She wore men's clothing and had cut her hair short to fight alongside him. 6 months pregnant with their fifth child, she refused to leave. Where Giuseppe went, she went. This had always been their way, forged in Brazilian battles and Uruguayan sieges. On April 30th, 1849, French forces under General Oudinot attacked Rome from the west. Oudinot expected an easy victory. His troops were professional soldiers, well trained in Napoleonic tactics, equipped with modern rifles and substantial artillery. They assumed they were attacking disorganized Italian rebels who would collapse under the first serious assault. They were catastrophically wrong. Garibaldi had positioned his forces brilliantly on Janiculum Hill, the high ground west of the Tiber River that dominated approaches to the city. When French columns advanced, they were met by withering defensive fire from prepared positions. The redshirts fought with desperate ferocity, knowing that defeat meant not just military loss, but the death of the Republic's ideals. The French assault shattered against Roman defenses. Columns broke, officers fell. Elite units that had never experienced defeat in European wars found themselves pinned down by what they'd dismissed as rabble. By day's end, French forces had suffered heavy casualties and were forced to withdraw in confusion. News of the victory electrified Rome. In cafes and squares, people who'd feared the worst suddenly allowed themselves to hope. Perhaps, against all reason, they could hold. Perhaps one of history's great cities could stand against the combined might of European reaction. Street vendors sold prints commemorating the battle. Poets composed odes to Garibaldi and his defenders. But Giuseppe knew better than to celebrate. Victory on April 30th had surprised the French, but Oudinot would learn from his mistakes. The next attack would be heavier, better prepared, overwhelming. In May, before the French could regroup, Giuseppe marched out of Rome to meet another threat. A Neapolitan army of about 6,000 men approaching from the south under General Ferdinando Lanza. These were Bourbon forces sent by King Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies to help crush the Republic. At Velletri, a town in the Alban Hills southeast of Rome, Giuseppe's forces encountered the Neapolitans. He attacked with his characteristic speed and aggression, catching Lanza's army off guard. The battle was fierce but brief. Neapolitan forces, demoralized by Republican ferocity, broke and retreated in disorder. It was another unlikely victory. Outnumbered defenders defeating a professional army through superior tactics and fighting spirit. 2 major victories in a month. Roman morale soared. Garibaldi was being hailed as a miracle worker, but miracles have limits, and the French were preparing to test those limits with overwhelming force. In early June, Oudinot brought reinforcements, heavy siege artillery, and a determination not to be humiliated again. The French army invested Rome completely, surrounding the city, cutting supply lines. This time, there would be no dramatic assault to be repulsed. This time, they would grind Rome down through systematic siege warfare. The defense of Rome through June 1849 became one of the most inspiring episodes of the entire Italian Risorgimento. Day after day, Garibaldi's volunteers held positions against relentless artillery bombardment. They fought from buildings whose walls crumbled around them, from barricades made of furniture and cobblestones, from rooftops turned into sniper positions. The city trembled under the impact of shells. Ancient walls that had stood for centuries developed breaches. Civilians huddled in. Cellars, emerging during brief lulls to tend wounded or carry water to fighters on the walls. People died by the hundreds. The hospitals overflowed with wounded. Food grew scarce as the siege tightened. Yet, the defense continued. Giuseppe was everywhere, inspecting positions, rallying troops, personally leading counterattacks when French forces gained footholds. He seemed to exist on willpower alone, sleeping perhaps 2 or 3 hours a night, eating when others remembered to bring him food. Anita was often beside him despite her advancing pregnancy, encouraging, organizing, refusing to be relegated to safety. On June 3, at Villa Corsini outside the western walls, one of the war's bloodiest engagements occurred. French forces had taken the villa, a strategic position that dominated the approaches to the walls. Giuseppe ordered repeated assaults to retake it. Wave after wave of defenders charged across open ground under murderous fire. Bodies piled up. The red shirts took horrific casualties. By day's end, Villa Corsini remained in French hands, and hundreds of defenders were dead or wounded. It was the first time Giuseppe's tactics had clearly, absolutely failed. The villa's capture proved his forces couldn't match French firepower and couldn't dislodge entrenched professional soldiers. It was a harbinger of the inevitable. Through the rest of June, French siege works crept closer. Artillery battered Roman defenses methodically. The end was approaching, visible to anyone who understood siege warfare. Yet still the defenders held, buying time that could no longer change the outcome, fighting because the fight itself had become the point. On June 29th, with Rome's defenses shattered and French forces pouring through multiple breaches in the walls, the Roman Assembly met in emergency session to debate surrender. Representatives argued through the night. Some wanted to continue fighting street by street, turning Rome into a bloodbath that would shame France before history. Others recognized that further resistance meant only civilian deaths, without altering the final result. The following afternoon, July 2, Giuseppe Garibaldi gathered what remained of his army in St. Peter's Square. Nearly 5,000 men stood in the gathering dusk, exhausted, many wounded, all understanding their cause was lost, but unwilling to simply submit. Anita sat on horseback beside Giuseppe, pregnancy visible but posture defiant. Giuseppe addressed them. His voice, hoarse from weeks of constant orders and encouragement, carried across the square. "This is what I have to offer you who wish to follow me," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "Hunger, cold, the heat of the sun. No wages, no barracks, no ammunition. But continual skirmishes, forced marches and bayonet fights. Those of you who love your country and love glory, follow me." It was not a promise of victory. It was a promise of suffering for a righteous cause. And nearly 5,000 men, along with Anita Garibaldi, chose to follow him into the unknown. Rome fell that day. The republic that had lasted less than 5 months ended, but its defense had become legend. Garibaldi's name was now spoken across Europe, not just as a fighter, but as the living embodiment of a dream that refused to die. What came next, however, would break him in ways no battle ever could. The tragic retreat. They left Rome as the sun set on July 2nd, 1849. Nearly 5,000 soldiers, a handful of women including Anita, and the weight of a failed revolution. 4 separate armies hunted them. French forces from the west, Austrians from the north, Spanish troops from the south, and Neapolitans from the southeast. Garibaldi led them northeast, hoping to reach Venice, which still resisted Austrian control. It was a death march disguised as a retreat. They moved through the sweltering July heat, avoiding main roads, marching through fields and forests. Supplies ran out almost immediately. Men deserted by the hundreds, vanishing into the countryside. Austrian cavalry patrols hunted them relentlessly. Skirmishes erupted without warning. The column shrank daily, bleeding fighters and hope. Anita should never have been there. 6 months pregnant, weakened from the siege, she had every reason to seek safety. Giuseppe begged her to go to Nice, to their children, to rest. She refused. Where he went, she went. That had always been their way. By late July, Garibaldi's force had dwindled to fewer than 2,000. They reached San Marino, the tiny independent republic on the Italian peninsula's eastern spine. There, exhausted and surrounded, Giuseppe made a desperate decision. They would try to reach Venice by sea, sailing up the Adriatic coast under cover of darkness. On August 2nd, they embarked from Cesenatico in fishing boats. 13 vessels slipped out into the night. Within hours, Austrian naval patrols spotted them. Only a few boats escaped. Giuseppe, Anita, and a small group of companions made it to shore near Comacchio, landing in the marshes and swamps of the Po Delta. Anita could barely walk. Malaria, contracted during the retreat, ravaged her body. She burned with fever. Her pregnancy made every step agony. Giuseppe carried her when she couldn't continue. They hid in reed beds during the day, moved through fetid water at night, hunted by Austrian patrols and local authorities who'd been ordered to capture Garibaldi at any cost. They found shelter at a farmhouse called Guiccioli, near the village of Mandriole. The farmer and his family, at immense risk to themselves, took them in. A bed was prepared for Anita. She was placed on clean sheets for the first time in weeks. But it was too late. The fever consumed her. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing Giuseppe, sometimes lost in delirium. On August 4, 1849, at 7:45 in the evening, Ana Maria de Jesus Ribeiro de Garibaldi died in her husband's arms. She was 27 years old. There was no time for mourning. Austrian soldiers were searching nearby. Giuseppe and his companions buried Anita hastily in a shallow grave behind the farmhouse. He couldn't stay, couldn't even mark the spot properly. The woman who had fought beside him through 12 years and 2 continents, who had borne his children and shared every danger, lay beneath anonymous soil as he fled into the night. Weeks later, a dog would dig up her body. It would be reburied. Years after that, her remains would be moved to Genoa and finally to Rome, to rest at the base of an equestrian statue erected in her honor on Janiculum Hill, where she had fought so bravely. But on that August night in 1849, Giuseppe Garibaldi knew only crushing loss. He escaped through the swamps and salt marshes with a handful of loyal men, including Giovanni Battista Culiolo, the sailor from La Maddalena who had helped him at Anita's death and would remain his friend for life. The Austrian net tightened. For weeks, Garibaldi moved like a ghost through northeastern Italy, protected by farmers and fishermen who hid him at risk of execution. Eventually, he reached the coast and was smuggled aboard a ship. The Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, which had opposed his Roman adventure, arrested him briefly, but then released him into exile. Garibaldi had nothing. His wife was dead. His revolution had failed. He was 42 years old, crippled by grief, and once again forced to leave Italy. He sailed first to Tangier, then to New York. In 1850, Giuseppe Garibaldi, the hero of 2 worlds, worked as a candle maker on Staten Island. He made candles in a friend's factory, lived in obscurity, and wrestled with sorrow that had no outlet. He made voyages to Peru, where he visited Manuela Sáenz, the legendary companion of Simón Bolívar, herself living in exile and poverty. Perhaps he found some kinship in her, another revolutionary who had sacrificed everything for an impossible dream. But Italy called to him still. It always would. In 1854, Giuseppe returned to Europe. Using an inheritance from his brother's death, he purchased half of Caprera, a small rocky island north of Sardinia. There he built a simple house in the style of South American farms. He planted trees, cultivated fields, raised animals. He tried to become a farmer. He couldn't escape who he was. Within 5 years, war would call him back, and when it did, Giuseppe Garibaldi would answer with a fury that would shake the foundations of Europe. The road to unity. Count Camillo Benso di Cavour was nothing like Giuseppe Garibaldi. Cavour was a master diplomat, a political strategist who believed in careful maneuvering and pragmatic alliances. He served as Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, under King Victor Emmanuel II. Where Garibaldi saw revolution and grand gestures, Cavour saw negotiation and incremental progress. The 2 men would never be friends, but they needed each other. By 1859, Cavour had achieved something remarkable. Through secret negotiations with French Emperor Napoleon III, he had secured French military support for a war against Austria. The Second Italian War of Independence began in April 1859. This time, Giuseppe Garibaldi would not be rejected. King Victor Emmanuel II appointed him a major general. Giuseppe formed a volunteer corps called the Hunters of the Alps, Cacciatori delle Alpi, composed of passionate patriots from across the Italian territories. They weren't professional soldiers, they were students, artisans, merchants, and farmers who believed in a free Italy. Garibaldi made them into fighters. In the Alpine foothills of Lombardy, Giuseppe and his hunters waged a brilliant campaign against Austrian forces. They won battles at Varese and Como, using speed and knowledge of terrain to compensate for their lack of training and equipment. The regular Piedmontese army and their French allies fought larger engagements to the south, but it was Garibaldi's daring raids that captured the public imagination. The war ended in July with an armistice. Austrian control of Venetia remained, but Lombardy passed to Piedmont Sardinia. It was a partial victory. More importantly, it proved that Austria could be beaten. The impossible had become merely difficult. But victory came with bitter cost for Garibaldi. As part of the deal with France, Cavour agreed to cede Nice and Savoy to Napoleon III. Nice, Giuseppe's birthplace, his hometown, the city where he'd grown up dreaming of the sea. It would become French territory. Giuseppe was furious. He felt betrayed. He made one of his rare appearances in Parliament to denounce the treaty, accusing Cavour and the king of violating the very principle of Italian nationalism they claimed to champion. The speech changed nothing. Nice became French. The wound would never fully heal. Personal grief compounded political frustration. In January 1860, Garibaldi married Giuseppina Raimondi, daughter of a marquis. It was an impulsive decision, perhaps driven by loneliness. On his wedding day, Giuseppe discovered that Giuseppina was 5 months pregnant by another man, possibly one of his own officers. Within hours of the ceremony, he abandoned her and returned to Caprera. The marriage would eventually be annulled, but the humiliation cut deep. He was 52 years old. Anita had been dead for over a decade, but no one could replace her. Giuseppe threw himself into farming, caring for his land, and brooding over Italy's incomplete unification. Then, in April 1860, news arrived that changed everything. Sicily had risen in revolt against Bourbon rule. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies, encompassing all of southern Italy and the island of Sicily, was one of the most oppressive regimes on the peninsula. Its people lived in poverty, while Bourbon royalty exploited them. Now, Sicilian patriots were calling for help. Garibaldi saw his moment. If he could liberate Sicily and southern Italy, if he could hand those territories to King Victor Emmanuel II, then Italy would be united from the Alps to the southern sea. The dream would be real. Cavour and the king were terrified. An uncontrolled Garibaldi expedition could spark a wider European conflict. France might intervene. Austria could use it as a pretext to reverse its defeats. But they also recognized an opportunity. If Garibaldi succeeded, Piedmont Sardinia would reap the benefits. If he failed, they could disavow him. They adopted a policy of deliberate ambiguity. They didn't officially authorize the expedition. They didn't stop it either. Giuseppe began recruiting volunteers. By May 1860, just over 1,000 men had answered his call. They came from Lombardy, Venetia, Genoa, Tuscany, Naples, Sicily. From every corner of Italian territory, and some from beyond. They were young, idealistic, poorly armed. Most had never seen combat. They wore red shirts and grey trousers. They called themselves simply I Mille, the Thousand. On the night of May 5th and 6th, 1860, they boarded 2 steamships, the Piemonte and the Lombardo, and sailed from Quarto, near Genoa. They carried outdated muskets, a few cannons, and an abundance of courage. The Bourbon kingdom of the Two Sicilies fielded an army of over 90,000 trained soldiers and a powerful navy. The odds were absurd. Victory seemed impossible. But Giuseppe Garibaldi had stopped caring about odds years ago. The Expedition of the Thousand, Part 1. The Mediterranean stretched dark and endless beneath the stars on those early May nights in 1860. Two small steamships, Piemonte and Lombardo, cut through the water with engines churning at maximum capacity, every man aboard intensely aware they were sailing toward either glory or swift death, with no middle ground possible. Giuseppe stood on the deck of the Piemonte, wind whipping his iconic poncho and red shirt, his weathered face turned towards Sicily, his mind calculating distances, dangers, and the 100 things that could go catastrophically wrong. The expedition was audacious to the point of insanity. They had 1,089 volunteers, the 1,000, as history would remember them, though the actual number slightly exceeded that mythic round figure. Most had never seen combat. They carried outdated muskets, many dating from the Napoleonic era and barely functional. They had 3 ancient cannons and limited ammunition. Their uniforms consisted of whatever red shirts and grey trousers could be scrounged. Against them stood the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, with over 90,000 trained soldiers, a powerful navy, fortified positions, and the resources of an established state. The Bourbon navy was actively hunting for them. If intercepted at sea, they had virtually no chance of survival or escape. The ships were lightly armed merchant vessels, not warships. Their army consisted of enthusiastic amateurs whose primary qualifications were passion for Italian unification and willingness to die for it. Everything depended on speed, deception, and fortune. They followed an unusual route to evade detection. After departing from Quarto near Genoa on the night of May 5-6, they sailed south, but hugged the Tunisian coast rather than taking direct bearing for Sicily. This added distance, but reduced the chance of encountering Bourbon patrol vessels in waters they controlled. Navigation was tense, staying close enough to the African coast to avoid detection, but not so close as to risk grounding on unfamiliar shores. On May 7th, they stopped briefly at Talamone on the Tuscan coast. Giuseppe, traveling under his credentials as a major general in the Piedmontese army, requisitioned ammunition and 3 old cannons. It was technically legal, but politically fraught. The government of Piedmont officially wasn't supporting this expedition, but also wasn't actively preventing it. On May 9th, they stopped again near Porto Santo Stefano for coal. Every delay increased risk of discovery, but without fuel they'd never reach Sicily. On May 11th, approaching Sicily's western coast, they learned from fishing boats that the port of Marsala was undefended. No Bourbon warships, no significant garrison. This was the break they desperately needed. But even luck required exploitation through decisive action. At 2:30 in the afternoon on May 11, 1860, the 1,000 landed at Marsala. It was organized chaos. The Piemonte and Lombardo couldn't dock properly at the harbor's wharves, so smaller boats ferried volunteers and equipment ashore. Men scrambled off vessels, hauling weapons and supplies, some slipping on wet wood and falling into the harbor. On the horizon, Bourbon warships suddenly appeared. 2 vessels that had been patrolling nearby and spotted the unusual activity. The Bourbon ships opened fire as the 1,000 were still disembarking. Shells whistled overhead, smashing into buildings along Marsala's waterfront. One shell struck a church, demolishing its roof. Another exploded in the harbor, sending up a geyser of water. Panic threatened. Men ashore shouted warnings. Those still aboard scrambled to get off. Confusion spread about whether they should abandon the landing or push forward. Giuseppe restored order through sheer force of personality. His voice carried above the explosions, commanding, directing, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of failure. The last volunteers reached shore. Equipment was hauled inland. The ships, having completed their mission, withdrew toward the open sea, drawing Bourbon fire away from the disembarked men. Miraculously, despite the bombardment, the thousands suffered only minimal casualties during the landing. Either Bourbon gunnery was poor, or fortune favored the audacious. Giuseppe didn't care which. They were ashore. There was no retreat now, no way back to the mainland. They would succeed or die in Sicily. Marsala's population watched uncertainly. Who were these red-shirted fighters? Could they be trusted? The town had experienced too many promises from too many armed groups. Liberation movements had come before and brought only different forms of oppression. Why should Giuseppe Garibaldi be different? He knew trust had to be earned through action, not speeches. The 1,000 moved quickly to secure the town, establish order, and begin the march inland. Sicilian volunteers started joining almost immediately. Young men, workers, some priests, people who'd heard rumors that Garibaldi was coming and had been waiting for this moment. By May 12th, the 1,000 had become 1,500. On May 14th, at Salemi, Giuseppe made his first major political declaration. Standing before a crowd of Sicilian townspeople in the main square, he announced that he was assuming dictatorship of Sicily in the name of King Victor Emmanuel II of Piedmont, Sardinia. Not in the name of a republic, not for himself, but for a monarch who might unify Italy under constitutional rule. This declaration shocked Mazzini and other Republican idealists. For years they'd preached that Italy must be a republic, that monarchy was incompatible with liberty. How could Garibaldi, who'd fought beside Mazzini in Rome, now embrace monarchist cause? But Giuseppe had learned through bitter experience that ideological purity meant nothing if it prevented actual results. Italy needed unity first, immediately, before the moment passed. The exact nature of Italy's government could be debated once the country actually existed as a unified entity, rather than a fragmented dream. Victor Emmanuel II wasn't an ideal leader, but he commanded real military forces and governed actual territory. The Republic had inspired people but controlled nothing permanent. Giuseppe chose effectiveness over principles. Sicilian volunteers continued joining daily. By May 15th, the force had swelled to around 1,500 trained fighters, plus hundreds of local irregulars called picciotti, who knew the terrain intimately. They weren't soldiers in any professional sense, but they could guide the 1,000 through mountain passes, identify Bourbon sympathizers, and provide intelligence about enemy movements. That same day, May 15th, 1860, came the first real test of whether this unlikely force could actually fight. The Battle of Calatafimi pitted Giuseppe's ragtag volunteers against 3,000 professional Bourbon soldiers under General Francesco Landi. The battlefield was a series of terraced hills, ancient agricultural land carved into steps by generations of Sicilian farmers. Landi's forces held the high ground, well positioned behind stone walls and earthworks, confident in their numerical and tactical superiority. They were trained military men, equipped with modern rifles and supported by artillery. They faced what they considered a mob of rebels led by a foreign adventurer. General Landi had good reason for confidence. His troops had fought numerous engagements and maintained discipline under fire. They occupied defensive positions that maximized their advantages. Standard military doctrine suggested that attacking uphill against entrenched positions with inferior numbers was suicidal. Giuseppe should have retreated, found better ground, waited for reinforcements. He attacked anyway. The battle began around mid-afternoon on May 15th in brutal heat. The sun beat down mercilessly on men already exhausted from days of marching. Bourbon artillery opened fire first, shells arcing toward redshirt positions, exploding with concussive force that threw up dirt and stone. Infantry formed defensive lines behind their fortifications, rifles ready, waiting for the attack they knew would come. Giuseppe led from the front, as he always did. His red shirts advanced uphill in loose formation, less parade ground perfect than Bourbon troops, but more adaptable to the broken terrain. Enemy fire began immediately. Rifle volleys crackling across the hillside, balls whipping through air, men falling with cries cut short. The attack should have faltered. Against professional soldiers in strong positions, untrained volunteers should have broken under that first withering fire. They didn't break. Men fell, yes, blood soaked into dry Sicilian soil. Wounded crawled toward cover or lay where they dropped, but the attack continued. The 1,000 climbing those terraced hills step by step, using walls as cover, advancing during lulls in enemy fire, refusing to retreat despite casualties. Some accounts claim that at a crucial moment, when the attack seemed to waver, Giuseppe himself grabbed a flag and planted it farther up the hill, marking how far they would advance. Others say he grabbed a wounded man and carried him forward, demonstrating through action that retreat wasn't an option. The exact details have been debated by historians for over a century and a half. What's indisputable is that Giuseppe's presence, his visible courage, his refusal to accept defeat, inspired men who, moments before, had been considering flight. The fighting became close and brutal as red shirts reached Bourbon lines. This wasn't the standoff rifle exchanges of early industrial warfare. This was hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets, rifle butts used as clubs, men grappling and stabbing at close range, where training mattered less than desperate fury. The Bourbon soldiers, professional and disciplined, suddenly found themselves in a type of combat their training hadn't emphasized. They'd prepared for set-piece battles against other conventional armies, not frenzied close-quarters brawls with men who seemed to have no regard for their own survival. The psychological shock of that assault, the sheer reckless courage of it, broke something in the defenders. Units began falling back, not in organized withdrawal but in confused retreat. General Landi, unable to rally his troops or understand how this was happening, ordered a general withdrawal to avoid complete rout. By late afternoon, the Bourbon forces were streaming away from Calatafimi in disorder, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and their reputation for invincibility. The Battle of Calatafimi was more than a military victory. It was a psychological earthquake. A force of untrained volunteers had defeated a much larger professional army in open battle. The Bourbon kingdom of the Two Sicilies suddenly looked vulnerable in ways it hadn't before. The myth of governmental invincibility shattered. If Garibaldi could win at Calatafimi, what else might be possible? News of the victory spread across Sicily like fire through dry grass. The Bourbon kingdom suddenly looked vulnerable. People who'd been waiting cautiously to see if Garibaldi would succeed started believing he might actually win. More Sicilians joined Garibaldi. His force grew to over 2,000. Local priests blessed the expedition. Women brought food and bandages. Entire villages turned out to cheer as the 1,000 marched past. But the greatest prize still awaited. Palermo, Sicily's capital, defended by 16,000 Bourbon troops. Giuseppe knew he couldn't take the city by conventional assault. He needed cunning, speed, and the help of Palermo's oppressed population. On May 26th, he approached the city under cover of darkness. Inside, sympathetic revolutionaries prepared to rise up when his attack began. On May 27, Garibaldi's forces struck multiple points simultaneously. Street fighting erupted. Barricades went up across the city. Palermo exploded into chaos. The Bourbon garrison, under General Ferdinando Lanza, had overwhelming numbers, but found themselves fighting an urban insurrection on multiple fronts. For 3 days the battle raged. Buildings burned. Civilians fought alongside red shirts. Lanza, desperate and panicking, ordered the bombardment of civilian areas. For 3 days artillery shells rained down on Palermo, killing 600 civilians. It was a war crime that only strengthened the resolve of the city's defenders. On June 6th, unable to suppress the rebellion and facing disintegration of his own command, General Lanza agreed to an armistice. The Bourbon garrison withdrew from Palermo. The capital of Sicily had fallen to Garibaldi. The impossible had happened. Again. The Expedition of the 1,000, Part 2. Sicily wasn't won. Palermo was a beginning, not an ending. Bourbon forces still held Messina and other strategic points, but Giuseppe Garibaldi now controlled the island's largest city and had proven that the kingdom of the Two Sicilies could be defeated. Reinforcements arrived. Volunteers from across Italy sailed to join him, inspired by news of his victories. By July, his army had grown to over 10,000 men. He organized them into brigades, appointed commanders, and continued his advance across the island. On July 20th, at Milazzo on Sicily's northeast coast, Garibaldi won another crucial battle. Bourbon forces were driven from the field. By the end of the month, only the fortress city of Messina remained in Bourbon hands. Giuseppe faced a decision. He could continue fighting to completely clear Sicily, or he could do something even bolder: invade the Italian mainland. The latter seemed suicidal. King Francis II of the Two Sicilies had regrouped his forces. The Neapolitan army numbered 25,000 men, defending the southern peninsula. Garibaldi would be crossing the narrow Strait of Messina with fewer than 5,000 soldiers to face them. He crossed on August 20th, 1860. The invasion of the mainland was less a military campaign than a triumphal procession. Town after town opened its gates. Neapolitan troops, their morale shattered, surrendered or deserted by the thousands. Some units defected entirely, joining Garibaldi's army. The Bourbon kingdom, rotten from within, collapsed like a structure whose foundations had turned to dust. Francis II abandoned Naples, the capital, and fled to the fortress of Gaeta on the coast. On September 7, 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi entered Naples as a liberator. Crowds packed the streets. People wept, cheered, threw flowers. He rode through the city on horseback, still wearing his South American poncho, still carrying Anita's striped scarf that he'd worn since her death. In 6 months, with little more than 1,000 volunteers, he had conquered an entire kingdom. But victory was incomplete. The Neapolitan army still held Gaeta and had rallied for one final stand along the Volturno River, north of Naples. And Giuseppe's very success had created a political crisis. Mazzini arrived in Naples, along with other radical Republicans. They urged Garibaldi to continue to Rome, to overthrow the Papal States, to establish a republic for all of Italy. The revolutionary moment was at hand. Why compromise with monarchy now? But Count Cavour and King Victor Emmanuel II had been watching closely. They saw Garibaldi's success as both an opportunity and a threat. If he continued his march, he might spark a wider war with France, which still protected the Pope. They needed to contain him, to take control of the situation. Cavour acted decisively. Claiming concern about Garibaldi possibly attacking Rome, Piedmontese forces invaded the Papal States, occupying Umbria and the Marche. This effectively blocked Giuseppe's path to Rome, while adding more territory to the growing Italian state. On October 1, 1860, the Neapolitan army made its last major stand at the Battle of the Volturno. 25,000 Bourbon troops attacked Garibaldi's positions in a desperate attempt to retake Naples. Giuseppe held the line, fighting off the assault over 2 days of brutal combat. But his forces were exhausted, his supplies dwindling. Then, from the north, Piedmontese troops arrived. The professional army of Victor Emmanuel II, fresh and well-equipped, swept away the remaining Bourbon resistance. On October 21, a plebiscite was held throughout southern Italy and Sicily. The question was simple: join the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia under Victor Emmanuel II, or remain independent. The vote was overwhelming, over 99% in favor of unification. 5 days later, on October 26, 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi met King Victor Emmanuel II near the town of Teano in southern Italy. The meeting at Teano. The road outside Teano was dusty and unremarkable. 2 armies faced each other: the red shirts who had conquered the south, and the professional forces of Piedmont who had secured the center. Between them rode 2 men who embodied opposite approaches to the same dream. King Victor Emmanuel II sat astride his horse in full military uniform, regal and commanding. Behind him stretched organized battalions, cavalry, artillery, the apparatus of a modern state. Giuseppe Garibaldi wore his red shirt and grey poncho, Anita's scarf still draped over his shoulder. Behind him stood his volunteers, sunburned and weary, carrying weapons that barely functioned, wearing uniforms that were more patchwork than fabric. They met in the middle of the road. Giuseppe saluted. "Hail to the King of Italy!" he called out. Victor Emmanuel extended his hand. They shook. In that gesture, the conquest of southern Italy was transferred from the Republican revolutionary to the monarchist king. Everything Garibaldi had fought for, Sicily, Naples, a kingdom's worth of territory, he gave away in a handshake. Mazzini never forgave him. The radical Republicans felt betrayed. How could Garibaldi hand Italy to a king after sacrificing so much for the dream of a republic? But Giuseppe understood something Mazzini never could. An Italy existed. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Venice remained under Austrian control. Rome stayed within the Papal States. But from the Alps to Sicily, the boot of Italy was unified under one banner for the first time in 13 centuries. He had subordinated his ideals to his nationalism. He had chosen unity over ideology. After the meeting, Victor Emmanuel asked Giuseppe to remain, to serve as governor of southern Italy, to accept rewards and titles befitting a national hero. Giuseppe refused everything except one thing. "Give me a bag of seed for my farm on Caprera," he said. The king offered noble titles. Giuseppe refused. The king offered vast estates. Giuseppe refused. The king offered military honors and a generous pension. Giuseppe took the seed and sailed back to his island. He returned to Caprera with almost nothing material, but he had given his country everything. On March 17, 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was officially proclaimed. Victor Emmanuel II became its first king. A parliament assembled in Turin. Italy, as a nation, was born. But the story wasn't over. Giuseppe Garibaldi had never been good at staying retired. Rome or death. The Kingdom of Italy existed, but it was incomplete. Rome, the ancient capital, the city that had given its name to an empire, remained under papal control, defended by a French garrison. To most Italians, a united Italy without Rome was like a body without a heart. Giuseppe felt this more acutely than most. He had fought for Rome in 1849 and watched it fall. Anita had died in the retreat from that failed defense. The eternal city haunted him. In 1862, he could no longer contain himself. Under the slogan, Roma o morte, Rome or death, Giuseppe raised another volunteer army in Sicily. He planned to march north, to take Rome by force, to complete Italian unification. The Italian government panicked. Victor Emmanuel II and his ministers feared French retaliation. Napoleon III had made clear he would defend Papal Rome. If Garibaldi attacked, France might invade Italy itself, unraveling everything that had been achieved. The government ordered Giuseppe to stand down. He refused. He believed, or convinced himself, that the king secretly supported him, that official opposition was just political theater. He marched north into Calabria. On August 29, 1862, at Aspromonte in the mountainous toe of Italy's boot, the Royal Italian Army confronted Garibaldi's volunteers, not Austrian forces, not French troops, their own army. The two sides faced each other in the afternoon heat. Italian soldiers on both sides. The colonel commanding the royal forces ordered Garibaldi's men to disperse. Giuseppe refused to order his volunteers to fire on fellow Italians. His men stood confused, waiting for direction. The royal troops opened fire. A brief, chaotic skirmish erupted. Giuseppe was shot in the ankle. His volunteers, unwilling to kill Italian soldiers, retreated in disarray. Garibaldi was captured and imprisoned. The wound in his foot never properly healed. For the rest of his life, he would walk with a limp, a physical reminder of being shot by the nation he'd helped create. Public outcry secured his release. Across Europe, especially in England where Garibaldi was idolized, people demanded his freedom. The Italian government, embarrassed, let him go back to Caprera. In April 1864, Giuseppe traveled to England. The reception was extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets of London to see him. Workers, aristocrats, intellectuals, all classes turned out. He met with Prime Minister Lord Palmerston and various revolutionaries living in English exile. For weeks, he was the most famous man in Britain. The adulation must have been bittersweet. He was celebrated as a hero, yet he'd been shot by his own countrymen. And Rome remained out of reach. He tried again in 1867. Once more he gathered volunteers. Once more he marched toward Rome under the slogan, Roma o morte. This time both French and Italian forces opposed him. At Mentana in November 1867, French troops equipped with the new chassepot rifle decimated Garibaldi's volunteers. The expedition ended in humiliating defeat. Giuseppe was arrested, again, released, again, sent back to Caprera, again. Rome would fall in 1870, but not by his hand. When France withdrew its garrison to fight the Franco-Prussian War, Italian troops occupied the city. The Papal States ceased to exist. Rome became the capital of Italy. But Garibaldi had nothing to do with it. There was one final campaign. In 1870, at age 63, Giuseppe offered his services to the French Republic in its war against Prussia. Despite his age, his old wounds, his body racked by arthritis, he led Italian volunteers in the Vosges Mountains. He won battles at Dijon and Autun, providing France with some of its only victories in that disastrous war. The French National Assembly elected him as a representative. He attended one session, found parliamentary politics tedious and frustrating, and resigned. Fighting he understood. Politics remained a mystery. After that, Giuseppe Garibaldi truly did retire. The final years. Caprera welcomed him back. The small rocky island, its windswept shores and scattered pines, had always been his refuge. Giuseppe had purchased the northern half in 1856. 10 years later, English friends had given him the southern half. Here, away from war and politics and the weight of legend, he could be simply a farmer. He built his house, the Casa Bianca, or White House, in the style of South American fazendas, simple and functional. He planted trees, including a massive pine, in February 1867 to commemorate the birth of his daughter Clelia. He cultivated fields and orchards. He raised chickens, sheep, horses and donkeys. He gave the donkeys names of his political enemies, which amused him greatly. His children lived with him when they could. Menotti, Teresa, and Ricciotti, the children he and Anita had raised together, were grown now. Giuseppe also had 3 children by his longtime companion, Francesca Armosino, a woman from Piedmont who had cared for him through his declining years. In 1880, he finally married her, legitimizing their children. The house was modest. Interconnected rooms opened onto each other, built around a small courtyard. No grand halls or elaborate furnishings. Giuseppe slept in a simple bed, positioned so he could see the sea. The kitchen had running water, one of the first in Italy, because he was fascinated by modern innovations. Tools and weapons from his campaigns hung on the walls. His library held books in multiple languages. Despite receiving a state pension from 1876, Giuseppe lived in relative poverty. He gave away most of what he earned. Visitors to Caprera often remarked on the contrast between his fame and his frugality. The hero who had conquered kingdoms lived like a peasant. His body betrayed him gradually. Arthritis, contracted from the damp nights of South American campaigns, crippled his joints. The bullet wound in his ankle from Aspromonte never fully healed. Malaria, caught in the marshes where Anita died, flared periodically. By the end, he could barely walk, but his mind remained sharp. He wrote his memoirs. He composed poetry, much of it heroic and not very good. He corresponded with socialists across Europe, having embraced socialist ideas in his final years. In 1879, he founded the League of Democracy, advocating universal suffrage, abolition of ecclesiastical property, emancipation of women, and maintaining a standing army. He was elected again to the Italian parliament. He attended rarely, finding the proceedings frustrating. Laws and procedures and compromises, these were not his realm. He had been a man of action, not words. Visitors made pilgrimages to Caprera. Young revolutionaries came seeking advice. Journalists came seeking stories. Admirers came simply to see him, this living legend. Giuseppe received them with courtesy, but he was tired. The years of war, of loss, of fighting for dreams that never quite materialized the way he'd hoped. They weighed on him. He often asked that his bed be moved, so he could gaze out at the sea. The same sea he'd sailed as a young merchant captain. The same sea he'd crossed to fight in South America, to return to Italy, to carry Anita's memory across decades. The sea that had been the one constant in his turbulent life. On June 2, 1882, at 6:21 in the evening, Giuseppe Garibaldi died at home on Caprera, 1 month shy of his 75th birthday. The clock in his bedroom was stopped at that moment. The calendar on the wall was left showing that date. They remain that way still, frozen in time, marking the instant the hero of two worlds passed from life into legend. Giuseppe had requested a simple funeral and cremation. Cremation was illegal in Italy at the time, so his wishes were ignored. His body was embalmed and buried in a tomb behind the White House, a massive, unhewn granite boulder with no inscription. In death as in life, he eschewed grand monuments. His remains rest there still, on the island he loved, facing the sea that had shaped his destiny, the legacy that never dies. The Italy that Giuseppe Garibaldi helped create has endured for over a century and a half. From the Alps to Sicily, the peninsula that had been divided for 1,300 years remains united. Rome serves as its capital. The dream of Mazzini, the guerrilla tactics learned in South America, the battles fought from Uruguay to Sicily, all of it crystallized into a nation. But numbers and borders don't capture the true measure of Garibaldi's legacy. He became, in his lifetime and after, a symbol of something larger than Italian nationalism. Hero of Two Worlds wasn't just a title. It was a recognition that his story belonged to anyone who fought against tyranny and oppression. His red shirts inspired revolutionary movements across the globe. His willingness to fight for others' freedom in South America before securing his own countries made him an icon of international solidarity. Ernesto Che Guevara would later say, "The only hero the world has ever needed is called Giuseppe Garibaldi." Abraham Lincoln invited him to serve as a general in the Union Army during the American Civil War. Giuseppe declined, disappointed that Lincoln wasn't more aggressive about abolishing slavery. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, his name became synonymous with the fight for national self-determination. 5 ships of the Italian Navy have borne his name, including an aircraft carrier that served as the fleet's flagship. Statues of him stand in squares across Italy and in other countries. A species of bright red-orange fish in the damselfish family was named Garibaldi after his red shirts. A rugby trophy between France and Italy bears his name. But the tangible memorials matter less than what he represented. Giuseppe Garibaldi was living proof that one person, driven by conviction, could change history. He had no royal blood, no formal military training, no political office until his victories forced recognition upon him. He was the son of fishermen who became a revolutionary, who became a legend. He sacrificed everything for Italy. His first wife, his years in exile, his health, the chance for wealth or power. When offered rewards, he asked only for seed for his farm. When given a kingdom's worth of territory, he handed it to someone else. This sacrifice wasn't weakness, it was the source of his strength. People followed Giuseppe Garibaldi because they knew he wanted nothing for himself. He fought not for glory or gain, but because he believed in something larger than any individual, the right of people to govern themselves, to be free from foreign domination and domestic tyranny. His relationship with Anita embodied this spirit. She wasn't a figurehead or a symbol. She was a fighter, his equal in courage and determination. Their partnership showed that revolutionary ideals and deep personal love weren't contradictory, but complementary. When Giuseppe wore her scarf to meet Victor Emmanuel II at Teano, he carried her memory into the founding of Italy itself. The story of Giuseppe Garibaldi reminds us that history isn't inevitable. Nations aren't formed by abstract forces. They're built by people who refuse to accept the world as it is and who are willing to risk everything to make it what it should be. Italy exists because Giuseppe Garibaldi existed. because he met Giovanni Battista Cuneo in a Russian inn and learned about a dream, because he met Anita Ribeiro and found someone to share every danger, because he led 1,000 men across the sea against impossible odds and won, because he gave away a kingdom rather than compromise his principles. Standing on Caprera today, looking out at the Mediterranean where that clock is still stopped at 6:21, where that calendar still reads June 2nd, 1882, you can feel the weight of what one life meant. The island is quiet now, peaceful. Pine trees sway in the wind, waves lap against rocky shores. But the silence isn't empty. It's full of echoes, of red-shirted volunteers marching up hills under fire, of Anita's defiant courage, of Giuseppe's voice in St. Peter's Square offering nothing but hardship to those who would follow him. The hero of two worlds rests beneath that rough granite stone, but his spirit? That never rests. It lives in every person who stands against injustice, in every fighter who refuses to accept oppression, in every dreamer who believes that impossible dreams can be made real through courage and sacrifice. Giuseppe Garibaldi didn't just create Italy. He showed us what it means to be fully, courageously, impossibly human. His legend will never die. Because the cause he served, the liberation of people from tyranny, will never cease being relevant. As long as freedom needs defenders, his story will inspire them. As long as there are those who dare to dream of a better world, Giuseppe Garibaldi will ride beside them, red shirt blazing, heart fierce with purpose, eyes fixed on the horizon where the impossible becomes real. These are not just stories. They are the echoes of real lives, lived with such intensity that they ripple through time itself. Giuseppe Garibaldi stood in the storm and didn't blink. He loved, he fought, he sacrificed, he won. If this story moved you, if you felt even a fraction of what those men and women felt standing on the slopes of Calatafimi or in the streets of Rome, then honor courage itself. Share this story, like this video, subscribe to carry the flame forward, because the next legend is already waiting to be told, and it might just be you.